What makes you laugh? When we have time to watch something together, Vicky and I, we usually watch comedies. It's about the only thing we can agree on. Vicky likes drama and I like action, but we both like comedy. I have to say though, I cannot remember the last time that I really laughed out loud. The last time I watched a comedy that made me laugh out loud. I get messages, maybe you do as well, where people will write LOL, laugh out loud, and yet I wonder how often they've actually laughed when they write that. Laughter plays an important role in our story today as we continue to think about encounters with God. We're looking at people in the Bible who have encountered God. We're asking ourselves what their stories can teach us about God and our own relationship with Him. Last week we thought about how important it is for God that we should have a relationship with Him. We saw this through the story of Noah. This week we're looking at Sarah and God's promise to her and her laughter. And I guess before we get too far into it, we should acknowledge that there are all sorts of different laughter. There are different reasons to laugh. By default, when I talked about laughter, I was talking about comedy. I guess we think about it as a positive thing. We laugh when we're amused, when something funny or joyful happens, it might make us laugh. But we laugh at other times as well, don't we? Some of us are very ticklish, and even though being tickled is absolutely no fun at all, it still makes us laugh. It's how I torture my children. Villains on TVs and in movies, they have an evil laugh, don't they? Sometimes we laugh without any humour at all in order to express our disbelief or displeasure. Almost a snort of laugh or a scoff. It sounds a little different. So we're going to look at the story of Sarah, and she ends up naming her son Isaac, and Isaac means he laughs. We're going to discover together who is laughing in this story and why. We start with a bit of background. God calls Abraham. Only back then he had a different name. He was called Abram, and that you can read about in Genesis 12. And when Abraham was the ripe old age of 75, he sets out to a new land, and he takes his wife with him, and his wife at the time was called Sarai. And God promises that Abraham and Sarai will have descendants like the stars in the sky. But right now they don't even have a single child, so that seems a bit strange. As the years pass, this old couple, they don't get any younger, and they don't seem to be any more likely to have children as they continue to age. But God makes his promise again and again. And eventually Sarai, she takes matters into her own hands. She sends her slave girl to her husband, deciding that they can have a child through this slave. But this isn't what the Lord had intended. It goes pretty badly with the slave girl Hagar and her son Ishmael. Eventually they have to leave. Two more significant things happen to Sarai. God tells Abraham to change her name, so he becomes Abraham and she becomes Sarah. And twice her husband leaves her with another man after pretending she's his sister and not his wife. It's not always entirely clear why he does this. I think to stop himself being slaughtered. And those episodes don't tend to end well for anybody. All in all, Sarah seems to have been treated a little harshly, I think. Pulled from pillar to post, used and not consulted. Maybe that was more normal in those days, but it still doesn't seem right to us. She makes her own mistakes as well, notably with Hagar. But what we discover from that incident is something profound, because it was as important for God that Sarah be the mother of nations as it was that Abraham be the father. No substitute would do. Sarah was important to God's plans. And this is made even more explicit in our reading today. Up until this point, we don't really hear what Sarah thinks of any of what's gone on, but now we hear her laugh. And Sarah's first laugh is one of derision. It's a bitter laugh. Maybe it's a sarcastic laugh. There is no joy in this laugh. It sums up maybe how Sarah feels about God and his promise. These three men have appeared. Abraham's treated them with honour. Now in the desert you'd be expected to give good hospitality, because after all, next time it might be you who's stuck in the desert in need of shelter and sustenance. But Abraham, he goes the extra step. He bows before these men. He washes their feet. He gives them the best food. And the reason becomes clear because it seems in what transpires next that God himself has come to visit. One of the visitors asks where Sarah is. And what transpires is surprising for two reasons. Firstly, the stranger knows Sarah's name, not having been introduced to her. And secondly, because he chooses to have a conversation with her. For a woman to have such a conversation with a man who's not of her household would be unusual. He wants to interact with her. The visitor declares again this promise of God. Sarah will bear a son. And Sarah, who we are told is very old and past the age of childbearing. Sarah laughs. She overhears it and she laughs. I can imagine it, maybe more of a snort than a laugh. Disbelief, the pain of childlessness, the ridiculousness of the idea that she might become a mother for the first time after all these years in her old age. Snort, a scoff. A laugh that sums up that pain, that bitterness. And when the visitor hears her, when he speaks again, it is to say to her, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Sarah's encounter with God doesn't seem to go very well. Abraham's spoken with God many times, but this is the first time Sarah seems to have done so. And her reaction to his words are disbelief at his promise and denial when he asks her about the laughter. She doesn't believe him and then she lies to him. But the story doesn't end here, of course. Sarah's encounter with God doesn't stop at this laugh of disbelief. This is the start of Genesis 21. Let me read it to you. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? And yet I have borne him a son in his old age." So what do we learn about Sarah's encounter with God? What do we learn about him? Firstly, we learn that God is faithful to keep his promises. This theme runs throughout the Bible. He guided his people to the promised land. He brought down the walls of Jericho. He made a shepherd boy king. Time and again, God makes promises and he keeps them. He promises to watch over his people and love them and to care for them. He promises a saviour and Jesus is born. He promises to set us free and Jesus dies to accomplish it. He promises life after death and Jesus' resurrection shows us that death has been defeated. When God promised an ageing Sarah a child, she did not need to take matters into her own hands. Because he did see it through. What God promises, he sees through. Which is wonderful because he's promised to be faithful to you as well and to me. God keeps his promises. Through Sarah's encounter, we can also see that God defies our expectations. Our verse for the year not so long ago was from Ephesians 3, and it said that God can do more than we can ask or imagine. The power of God can do the impossible, the unimaginable. It can bring down fire from the heavens. It can cure the sick. It can bring the dead to life. Sarah desperately wanted a child. We see that in Genesis 21. She wasn't resistant to what God wanted to do. She didn't try and prevent his will for her. She was on board with the plan. She just didn't think it would come to fruition. She didn't expect it to ever happen. She wanted it. She didn't believe it could come about. But God defies our expectations of him. I love this. It means that God's actions do not depend upon our level of faith. Let me say that again. The actions of God do not depend on how much faith we have. Our own doubts cannot halt the power of God. Sarah might not have believed that she could have a child. She didn't think God could do it, but that did not stop him. It makes me so angry when people claim that God's will is subject to our belief or doubt. I'm sure you've heard it before. Some people will say that so-and-so wasn't healed because they didn't have enough faith. That you didn't get the job that you wanted because you didn't believe in God enough for it. You weren't praying hard enough. That God hasn't changed things by his wondrous power because of your doubts. That is absolute nonsense. I cannot thwart the will of God by a lack of faith. By doubting, Sarah didn't stop God's will. Sarah didn't need to believe that God could give her a child for him to move in power. And this isn't to say that faith is unimportant, because our faith, trusting in him, believing in him, that's what leads us to life. Faith is what draws us into a relationship with God. Faith is what brings us to seek forgiveness. Faith is what steers us to obedience to Christ. Our faith has a huge impact on our relationship with God. But the level of our faith, how deeply we believe, or how many doubts we have, does not, cannot impact God's almighty, powerful actions. You're not that powerful, nor am I. And that's because with God, all things are possible. Jesus says that, doesn't he, in Matthew 19? He's talking about a rich man entering the kingdom of heaven. He says, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And it echoes the visitor's words to Sarah. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Nothing is impossible. Nothing is too difficult. With God all things are possible, and he is faithful to fulfill his promises. So trust in him. And ultimately what this means for Sarah is that her laugh, her snort of disbelief, turns into a laugh of joy. In Genesis 21 we read that, didn't we? God has brought me laughter, she says. Isaac, whose name means he laughs. I love this. That laugh of disbelief became important. It was a mark of Sarah's doubt. It was a lack of trust in God. But God turns that laugh of disbelief on its head. He proves her wrong. He proves himself faithful and trustworthy. And Sarah, having been proved wrong, she doesn't sulk. She rejoices in the good gifts of our faithful God. I like to think in this story that it's God getting the last laugh, as he turns Sarah's laugh joyously on its head. As I close, I'd like to say three things. Firstly, remember that God can defy our expectations, that nothing is impossible for him. Secondly, be prepared for God to prove you wrong, to bring laughs of joy from snorts of disbelief, to bring life from despair. And finally, remember the faithful God who sent a child of promise, through whom all the world might receive a blessing. And may you be blessed by him too today.